Okay. So yeah, we'll be doing an overview of the tools in Photoshop, the windows, what you see when you're looking at Photoshop, how some of the most common things work, and then we'll go into a couple examples of practical things that you would use Photoshop for working with photos. So to jump right into it, I have this great photo, boolip.jpg, that you'll all have soon. And so we're just going to bring this into Photoshop to start working with it. So you can just click and drag it right into this big canvas area here in order to import it. Okay. So this is what you're going to see when you bring your photo first in. So first I'm going to talk about the layers panel down in the bottom right corner. So when you bring in different images, they're each going to be put onto a separate layer. You can also create new layers to work with in Photoshop. You can create a new layer using this little item right here. This little icon right down in the bottom right corner. Create a new layer. Or also by going up to this menu at the top, layer, new, layer. So those will give you blank layers that are all just transparent, nothing on them. If I wanted to, I could duplicate this image onto a new layer by right-clicking and selecting duplicate layer. And so we see that basically whatever you have, let me just draw on this one real quick so that we can tell a difference. Okay, so whichever layer you have on top in your layers panel over here is basically going to be shown on top of the ones underneath. So within this panel, we have a few things up top. We have opacity, which works the same as it does in any of the other Adobe programs. You can bring down the opacity of an entire layer in order to see partially through it. We have fill, which works pretty similarly to opacity. And then we have a few other things up here. We have some things relating to text, layer stuff, but we're not going to get into that just yet. So those are the basics of the layers panel over here. All right, so in our canvas, this is our working area. There's a few things you can do that are helpful working with the canvas. You can view, for example, just the red, green, or blue layers by using Command 2, 3, and 4, or by selecting the channels panel, which is right next to the layers panel. You can turn them on and off with the eyeball in order to just look at certain ones, or you can leave them all on. When you're working in our canvas, so we're using a brush right now. That's one of the tools over on this side menu. So if you were to be painting on this image, you work on it in the canvas. Makes sense. So let's take a look at some of the tools over on this panel on the far left side here. So working down from the top, we first have the Move tool. And this does not include all of the composite channels. What did I do? I have not seen that before.
I haven't seen that either. Usually it's just like what are the composite? Oh, these?
Oh, just select RG.
There you go.
There it is. Okay, so the Move tool is basically just kind of like your cursor that you would use in most other programs, like the hand tool type thing. Not the hand tool, sorry. The pointer tool in Premiere or After Effects, so you can use it to click and drag and move around an image. Under that, we have our marquee selection tools. So on any of these menus, a lot of them have multiple options that are collapsed down within one icon. So if you just click and hold on one of these icons, it'll bring up the submenu of similar tools. So we see the rectangular marquee tool. You click and drag to select the pixels within a certain area dictated by a rectangle. But we could also click and hold and change that to the elliptical marquee tool if we wanted to select pixels within an ellipse. And then underneath that, we have our lasso tools. So the standard lasso, you just click and draw in order to select an area of pixels. Also in this menu, we have the polygonal lasso tool. You click to create points, and you can create a polygon shape in order to select pixels within that region. And then you can double click to close off your polygon and make the selection. We have the magnetic lasso tool, which will basically follow as you click and hold down and move your cursor. It'll follow along the edges between different colors that it finds. So if you're creating an outline to like cut out something from your image, that's a quick way to sort of get the image cut out, but it's not always the most reliable. It gets tricky when you're working with colors that are similar to each other, right next to each other. So that's another option we have there. If we have an area selected and we want to deselect that area, you can use Command D to deselect so that you're not stuck working within that one area. When you do have a selection, say I'm using the brush tool and I'm trying to paint over here and we don't see anything happening. That's because we have this selection, which is signified by the dashed moving lines. We can only work within that selected area. So if that's the case, you can just Command D to deselect and go back to your normal working. Okay, underneath, let's see, we just did the lasso tool, so next we have the quick selection tool and the magic wand tool. So these tools are basically, quick selection just follows a click and drag of your mouse and tries to guess what you're clicking and dragging at. It's a quick and dirty way to select a big area. And then we have the magic wand tool. The magic wand tool basically selects pixels in an area based off color. So if you have pixels that are right next to each other that are a similar color, it'll select them. Sometimes it can be a little iffy because of the tolerance setting that we have up right at the top of the screen here. So the higher that tolerance is, the more likely it is to pick up pixels of a wider range of color. So if your tolerance is 0, it's going to be very, very exact. It's hardly going to select any pixels, but if you have a higher tolerance number, if I select 100 here, it selects more of that area. Okay, so that's our magic wand tool. Underneath that, we have the crop tool. You just can click and drag in the corners here, and you see a preview with like the guidelines on the thirds to see how your image would look when it's cropped. Once you let go after clicking and dragging, you just hit enter in order to crop your image, and it makes the image smaller. Underneath that, we have the eyedropper tool. The eyedropper tool you can use to click a point in the image in order to select the color of the pixel you clicked on. So if I were trying to get a brown color based off of the color of this bear, I can use the eyedropper tool, click on the bear, and it selected that color for me. And so now if I were to use a brush to paint, it would paint in that color. Let's see, that was eyedropper. Underneath that, we have spot healing. Is not something I personally use a whole ton.
Are you gonna go into that? Yeah, I can talk about more.
Okay, so yeah, we can get into that one a little bit later. The brush tool you've seen me use a little bit. Just paints based off of a selected color that you have. And there's different brush settings. You can have things like, as we went over in the previous demo in Photoshop for video graphics, you can change the size of the brush, you can change the hardness of the brush so that it has kind of soft edges. So all sorts of brush settings you can mess around with. Underneath the brush here, we have the clone stamp tool. What the clone stamp tool does is it basically is used to take areas of an image and duplicate them into other areas. So this is really good for when you're trying to cover things up and make it look like it fits into part of the picture. So say I have this brown space over here that I colored over, and I mean I could very easily get rid of it just by undoing and stuff, but I want to cover it up using some of these trees in the background. So this isn't going to look perfect because it's not going to be like the most natural, but it'll work for an example. So with the clone stamp tool, you can just hold Option key and click in order to choose the point that you're selecting to start stamping onto another part of the image. And then when you click and drag with this brush, it will draw based off of the part of the image that you stamped. So to give you kind of a better example of that, I'll choose the area right next to the bear here just so you can see the change happening. So our brush is going to start out green because we selected this green area right next to the eye, but then as I move to the right, you see the bear starting to appear, and we're painting that part of the image back over somewhere else. So when using the clone stamp tool, it can be good to select from multiple different areas so that you don't see the same pattern repeating itself over and over again. If I were to choose one part of the plants here, and then just repeatedly do the same like stroke over and over again, it's just gonna duplicate a big area of that. So in order to basically make it look more realistic and more blended in, it's good to just choose different areas as your starting point in order to just make that look a little more natural. Okay. Underneath clone stamp, we have history brush. We don't really need to go into the eraser tool. We'll just erase images as long as it's a rasterized image. So that leaves this white and gray checkerboard background, which is transparency. We've talked a little bit about alpha channels, so that means there's no color on this channel. It's just transparent. If you export it in a format that allows transparency, like PNGs, that will come through as empty and can see through behind it whenever you use that PNG somewhere else. Underneath that, we have our gradient tool, which is basically just used for drawing a gradient between the two colors that you have selected as your primary and secondary color. We have, in that same menu, the paint bucket tool. The paint bucket tool basically will take whatever color you have and fill the area around it. And similar to how we had tolerance when we were using the magic wand tool earlier, the paint bucket tool has a tolerance, and that'll basically decide on where it chooses to fill with this color and where it chooses not to. So if you bump our tolerance up super high, you can see that it filled in most of the image with our primary brush color. And if you bring it down lower,
Show where you're talking about primary and secondary.
sure. So farther down on this same panel here, we see there's two little squares. There's the color that's been drawing the whole time, and then there's this little white color. And so with the gradient tool, I had mentioned primary and secondary color. It went from this brownish color to this white. If I were to click this little 90-degree two arrows that are right above the two swatches there, it'll swap your primary and secondary colors. And you can reset your colors using this little window up at the top right here, using the eyedropper tool. There's a couple different ways to do that. And so now if I were to use the gradient tool to draw again, it goes from red to brown instead of from white to brown. Okay, so those are the tools that I tend to use the most. There's a few other things that we've seen similar things before, like a pen tool, a text tool, a shape tool. Those work the exact, or at least similarly to the way we've been seeing them in After Effects and Illustrator, and we used them a little bit in Photoshop last time. So those cover most of our common tools here. I'll just dive a little bit into the menus up top, and then we'll be ready to start working on one of these projects. So first of all, in the File menu, that's pretty standard stuff. Creating new files, saving, exporting, all that. In the Edit menu up here, one common thing that I use a lot is Transform. Within the Transform menu, you'll have ways that you can distort your image. You could rotate it, flip it, things like that. But you can dive through these menus a little bit on your own if you're interested in seeing what some of these other options do. The Image menu is a pretty common one that you'll be using a lot. So first of all, we see this drop down for Mode, which basically just determines how you're looking at this image, how it's being interpreted. So we see it has selected RGB color right now. RGB is the standard for when you're working with anything for web, for video, things like that. Underneath we see CMYK. Does anybody know what CMYK is? Maggie?
Like what it stands for, or just like what it's
Anything
used
about
for?
it?
It's used
Either.
for printing because it mixes, it actually tells you the mixture of the ink
Mhm.
style. Just cyan, magenta, yellow.
Yeah, so those are just the inverse of red, green, and blue. So cyan is the opposite of red as far as colors go. So that's just a way that works better for print, as Maggie said. We see 8 bits, 16 bits, and 32 bits. That just has to do with how much color information is being kept. So the higher the bits in this are, basically the more data is going to be kept. The larger your files will be, but the more control you kind of have over it. Adjustments is a very common submenu to use. We see a lot of our main adjustment effects in here. We see brightness and contrast, our curves, our hue and saturation. These are things you're going to use a lot when working with photos. There's multiple ways you can use these, but when you select one of them from this menu, it will apply it directly to the layer that you have selected. So right now we have this layer 0 selected. If I were to throw a curves effect onto it, so I think Gabby was going to talk, or maybe Nico was going to talk a little bit about a couple of these effects, but basically curves lets you modify the RGB channels altogether or any one of those individually. So just to show you what it's doing, basically it's applying this effect directly to the image. We can kind of see the thumbnail changing down in the layers panel there because the effect is being applied directly onto it. So keep that in mind. If you are selecting some of these adjustments from the image adjustment submenu, it'll go directly onto the layer. Other things that are important on here, image size and canvas size. So if you change your image size, I can show an example of that right here. It's basically going to squash or stretch the image into the new size that you asked for. So if I were to bring this down from 10 inches, unlike these, to 2 inches, we see that it squashed the image there. Whereas if I were to change the canvas size, it's going to keep all the information for this image intact, and it's just going to change the size of the canvas, the area that you're working in. So if I were to make this canvas bigger, we see that we have a bunch of transparent pixels surrounding this image because our image stayed the same size. We weren't changing the size of this picture or anything. It was just the size of our work area, basically. All right. We have the layer panel over here, which we quickly talked about before. You can use it to create a new layer, to duplicate a layer. A lot of the things that you'll see in the layer menu are similar to what you'll see when you right-click on one of these layers. You see duplicate layer and like those copy CSS and SVG type things. There's a lot of similar things between those two. Let's see. These menus aren't quite as commonly used. Filter will give you some options like blurs. If I wanted to add, say, a Gaussian blur to my image, you would do so from the filters menu. And that will work the same way as the adjustments. It's going to apply it directly to the image from this menu. Window is basically just changing what you're seeing on the screen. So for example, if I wanted to show a different way of doing adjustments, I could bring up the adjustments window here, and it brings up this thing we see on the right side, where it has a lot of those same effects we were just looking at from the image adjustments submenu. We see brightness and contrast, curves, hue and saturation, all those kind of things. That's just a different way of adding these same adjustments to your composition. So there's different windows that each have different purposes. Sometimes you'll see things appear on this little bar along the right side here when you open them up from the window drop-down menu. For example, if I bring up brush, oh, just kidding. On mine, it's set up differently. Well, that's how the window menu works. If you need to change any of like your brush information or things like that, and you're not sure where, just make sure that the window that you're looking for is turned on, or if you're trying to hide something that's being shown, you can turn it off through the window menu. And then the last thing we have to talk about is right up at the top here. So you'll see that as I change between different tools, this is always changing what we see up top. These are basically just various like options that relate to the tool that you currently have selected. So when I use a brush, I can change things like my brush size and hardness, the opacity of the brush stroke that I'm making, so whether it makes a brush stroke that completely covers the pixel that's being painted on or whether it partially covers it. So there's just a bunch of options relating to the tools that you're currently using. And I think that mostly covers what I wanted to go over. So does anybody have any questions about things we looked at and saw in the interface here? Anything confusing? Did I lose anybody anywhere? Cool. So I will pass it off to Gabby. Did you want to go next? Cool.
So does everyone have the file? The photo
Give
file?
them just the raw file.
The raw file? Okay, that's fine.
You might have to tell them how to use the raw.
So opening the raw file is pretty much just like any other image. Do you guys know what a raw file is? Yes, no, just nods of heads. Yeah, no, you don't know. Raw file is basically just like a type of, like when you're shooting photography, it's just a type of image digitally that you shoot. So it's like the highest possible quality. So I always shoot in RAW because I always want the highest possible quality. As opposed to some people who shoot in JPEGs and whatnot, it's just so they have the like smaller file, but it's lossy, so it loses quality like when you're shooting in JPEGs. So I personally shoot in RAW, and so it's just like any other file or image. You just click and drag it into Photoshop, and it automatically. So since it's a raw image, it'll open up in Camera Raw first, and you can kind of edit any of like the little adjustments, whatnot, so like exposure, contrast, highlights and shadows. I personally don't use Camera Raw just because I like to do everything in Photoshop. But you just click OK and it opens it up right in Photoshop. And why did it do that? Alright, I didn't want that, but okay. Just close this one? Okay.
Oh, wait, no, cancel. Close the window of the canvas of the little top corner, just underneath where you had put before. It says boolib.jpg.
Oh. Well, it's the same thing. That's what I just did. Okay. Never mind. Okay, so now you have your image, clicking and dragging into Photoshop.
Can we shift the program over?
Oh, yeah. This way? That work? Okay. So I'm also going to pull up the regular Photoshop file just so you guys can get an idea of what it ended up looking out. So I created this movie poster. I took this image in the studio and then I edited all of this in Photoshop. So to get some of these effects within Photoshop, there's definitely one of two. Why is this doing that? There's one of two ways you can get to that kind of effect with like, at least like starting with the background. So the first thing I did was I used the crop tool just because we shot this in the studio and we had the hands painted black. So in order to make it look more horror-like, just kind of the crop tool and just kind of reshaped it a bit just because of the lens that I shot with. And then there's one of two ways you can get to a different color for the background. So there's one way you could do File, New, and you could do that with pixels. I use inches. I know with you guys for post-production purposes you would probably use pixels, but since I print images, I use inches. So just to give you guys an idea, I'm just gonna so basically what I'm doing is I'm just formatting the whole new layer to my needs of what I want the image to look like. So I up the resolution, I make the parameters of like page size, and then you can just hit create since you're doing File, New. And so once you have your whole new background, you could either change the color if you rasterize the background. You could just use the paint bucket tool. Where did it go? Let's do. So, paint bucket tool. You just click, and it changes the color for you. And so one way, again, is to just use the quick selection tool. If you want to just get this whole area and drag it into the new layer. So you could just cut and paste. And in order to adjust the size of the new layer, you could just hit Command T, and that's like the free transform tool. So that would just adjust the size of the layer that you just dragged in. And so that's what it could look like. I'm just gonna make it a little bit bigger so it fits the full frame. Also, when you're in like the free transform tool and you're like dragging your image around or you're resizing it, don't be afraid just because it looks a little bit pixelated in that process. It's just getting used to like being in this new layer and formatting. So now that we've selected it and dragged it into the new layer, you can, the other option to do that is back. You can just do, go to adjustments, and again, you could do the selection tool, but you could just select like the background layer. And when you do that, you could hit selective color, and you can adjust the background to pretty much any color you want. So just make sure that since the background is white, you adjust, why is that doing that? So you see the color is adjusting? Yeah. So you could do that, or that might be a bit easier. It depends on your preference of what you want to do.
Can I just jump in for 1 second?
Yeah, go for
Can you go back to the other?
Yeah.
So before we talked about how when you add effects from image adjustments from that menu, it applies it directly to an image. But we see when she made an adjustment using the adjustments panel, it instead made a new layer above the layer that she was working on, and it's called selective color 1, just the first layer of that effect. Basically what that's doing is it's creating a new layer to put that effect on. And so that's just gonna basically disassociate the effect from the actual image itself. You're not editing the original image, you're just altering it by using what's called an adjustment layer. So that's what that is.
So does anyone have any questions so far about what I did? Okay, cool. So going back to our file, so you've made the background the color that you want, you have your layer in, and you want to kind of get like this overlay of like a red effect. So what I did was I used the gradient tool. Gradient. And you just kind of adjust like the degree or scale of it, of how intense you want it to be. Or you could just also click through different options of what the gradient could look like. I had the gradient pretty much over the whole thing to get more of like that kind of spooky effect. And so then what we can do is I can go through the clone stamp tool. So pretty much what I used the clone stamp tool for was because the black wasn't covering the full arm. So you can clearly see that like the paint isn't covering the full arm and that you want it to, just because of like it doesn't look fully finished. And so also when you're using the clone stamp tool, you want to make sure that your layer is selected on what you want it to apply to. And then again, you're going to click option as David was explaining it. You're just going to go over the areas that you want it to.
Hide the adjustment layer.
What adjustment? This?
Like the layer in your like layers panel at the very top that has the adjustment, the effect on it.
The red.
This.
No. Turn off the red above your image.
Sorry. Oh. Yeah. Thanks. So that's pretty much how that comes out. But also sometimes when you're using the clone stamp tool and you're kind of like moving with it, it kind of looks like you can tell like where the edits are made. It just looks very unfinished. I'll zoom in. It just doesn't look exactly how you want it to. So sometimes what could help is going over with the spot healing tool. So with the difference between the spot healing tool and the clone stamp tool is that the spot healing brush deletes pixels while the clone stamp tool just covers up other pixels. But sometimes the spot healing tool brush kind of helps with blending effects of colors. So if you're kind of just going over it like that, you can see that the pixels are blending together, so it looks a little bit more finished than how it was with the clone stamp tool. So,
Just to kind of go over that for you, the clone stamp tool is going to take whatever texture is already there and put it back in. The difference with this spot healing is that it's looking at the underlying texture of the image, the underlying frequency of the pixels, and it's trying to replicate that frequency into the image so it looks more like it's part of the image because it's using the actual frequencies underneath. So it's a different noise separator in terms of how it's copying stuff.
Another difference is the clone stamp tool is a manually set source, so she's choosing from where in the image she'd like to take something and she's applying it where she's clicking, versus the spot healing is just selecting an area that she wants to make edits to, and then it is taking the surrounding area and trying to match that. So like if we're getting rid of a simple blemish, it'd be a good tool because it just looks at the area around it and matches.
So also just to go over like how we saw with the gradient, without the gradient, there's like the little eye in like your layers, and just like clicking it on and off makes you be able to like see with or without that layer on or off. And again, David went over like the opacity, so you could also adjust the opacity of your gradient and whatnot, or even like the layer too. So I did that a little bit, make it a little more faded. What else? And then I used the text tool. I used like a special font, but also what I did was there was also, since like some of the edges are a little bit rough, when you're selecting that part to make it a layer, you just go to refine edge. So you would just go to refine edge and just like feather it and whatnot. But what you could also do is you could use the blur tool if it doesn't help with the exact effect that you want it to. So the blur tool will just kind of, again, blur your edges a little bit. So you can kind of see the difference with the pixels between this area and then more above up here, where it's still very rough. Does anyone have any questions? What's up, Nick?
What was the shortcut you used to make your brush size bigger?
Oh, there's the brackets. I personally just like use a couple of it. Yeah, so like the outside, like the left bracket makes it smaller and the right bracket makes it bigger. Yeah, that's just a keyboard shortcut that I always use.
That also goes the same for After Effects also.
Within Adobe.
Any other questions? Do you want to use these or no?
No, I'm gonna use a different one actually. I have the file somewhere.
So now we're going to transition away from kind of the portrait photography and kind of the user tools, and we're going to try to use it for a use case, creating
Some visual effects. So if you guys were here the last couple weeks, or probably the last 2 weeks, we've done some visual effects stuff. So that's my department, and I'm going to kind of show this ties in a way. So let me get the files up real quick. Nico time. So, oh, this is on. Oh yeah. Okay. So we have this footage of this girl kicking a soccer ball, but someone left the light in the shot by accident. Of course, it's pretty hard to miss. But you have to get rid of that. How do you take a light out of a shot? So the way we do that is through painting, and when I say painting, it's the same thing as making a clean plate for in Photoshop, how Gabby just showed you with the clone stamp tool. So
Can you explain what a clean plate is?
sure, yeah. So we mentioned it last time, but a clean plate is the reference for your image that you're trying to change. So just to give the actual example. So this is our actual footage, and this is just one frame that I took of it, and you can see where the light is and where we need to get rid of it, just based on this one frame. And by getting rid of something, we're making a clean plate that then we can reference to create an effect later on.
Yeah, we can use it as a background. We can cut everything else out and put it up on top of it.
Yep, it'll make more sense as we go.
Basically, in production, they should have not had that light there. And you could have on set shot a clean plate, which would be just the bushes and the trees and everything in this camera setup right here, without the light, with her gone. And since they didn't shoot that, now we have to create it from nothing.
The benefit of having a clean plate to begin with, say they had shot one, like she said, without the light, the girl, just the setting, you could have just cut out the lamp or the light and put the background behind it. But if you cut out the lamp here, you're gonna have nothing behind it. The data technically is hidden because it is behind the light. So we have to replicate that, and we do that with painting. So I'm not going to do things exactly like Gabby does, just because I think a little differently as far as with the actions I take. Because the number one thing for me is I'm always trying to do things that are changeable, and I only want to work with a program once. So whereas some of the moves that she made in the photo world are a little more permanent because she knows the changes she wants to make, the changes I make are more temporary, whereas I can change them or I can go back and nothing's permanent. Because for me, the worst thing for me to do is to make a mistake in creating this and not having something to go back on. So having like backups and stuff and ways to undo stuff. So you'll notice that. So the first thing I would do when I'm taking an image is, you guys should have this, right? Does everyone have this too?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's got it.
Okay. So I always make a copy of my background because it's that way I just have kind of a backup of backups. This is just within the program. I have a backup that if everything else blows up, I have this that's locked, so I can't touch it. So then I have my background here. And in the same way, I would do this in a visual effects program. We're going to just paint just like in Photoshop. So you can use the clone stamp tool. And now what I would do is, so let's just take a look at the area with the girl in the light. So we need to get rid of everything that shouldn't be there. But the problem with this shot specifically is because the girl and the light are kind of touching and they're overlapped. You have to get rid of both. So usually you only have to get rid of the light, but because the girl's in front of the light, you have to get rid of both. So the way to do that is I would start by choosing my brush size with the brackets. Nick? Yeah. And then just how Gabby did, I would select by holding Option or Alt, whatever, and choosing an area that I want. And if I let go, it'll move over, and you'll actually notice. Let me get bigger, you'll see it. You'll notice it's literally just taking that part of the image and replicating it. So she probably explained that, but just reiterating it so you can see it again. And the other thing I want to do is I want to look at my brush styles. So up here in this menu right here, you'll see this drop down. You'll have all these options as far as what the brushes you can choose. We saw David go into that. But what I'm interested in is right here with the size and hardness. So hardness is similar to opacity, but with a brush, it is the feathered or the softness of the edge. So if I have 0% hardness, it's going to be a very soft brush stroke. So you'll see kind of, does that really come across? If you can kind of see how blurred that edge is of that versus when I make it 100% hard, you'll notice it's a very solid, you notice the edges kind of deal. So I want to choose something that's going to hide pretty well. So I want to hide my work, so I'm going to go a little bit softer of a brush, and then you can always adjust as you go. I'm going to zoom in. So I'm trying to get rid of the light, so I'm going to go right next to the light because that's really what I want. It's the closest thing to what's actually behind it because we need to make it up. I'm going to select the area right next to it. I'm going to move over, and I'm just going to click. And just like that, you've already started the clean play. Cool. And then really from there, it's just a long and tedious process of getting rid of it. So you're just going to go through, reset your point, redo it, reset your point, move it. You can keep it where it is, just kind of do it. But you'll notice as I go down, you'll see that kind of crosshair. And wherever that's going to go, it's going to stay in perspective, or we're going to stay opposite, offset. It's going to stay as an offset of my brushstroke. So as I go down, it's going to keep following, and then you'll kind of get this mess where you have that. So you don't want to go over something when you start to notice that the crosshair goes over something that is already done or is not clean, then you should have to reset it. Or you'll notice sometimes, I don't know, does this happen in Photoshop that where you can source like what's underneath? Does that happen in this?
You mean source with the movie?
So like
No, not
No.
like Fusion.
not like Fusion.
No,
Okay,
it's
so
not.
then forget that. That was in Fusion. It would make more
No,
sense.
it's destructive as you're doing it.
Okay.
So it deletes
It's rewriting of those pixels.
Yes.
You're
Do I,
painting from when you paint,
yes. Should I explain that about that?
show that history.
Sure. So, if you didn't hear what you said, it was destructive, or what Jeremy was saying. So everything I'm doing is happening to the image. It's not saving what is actually underneath. I'm permanently changing. But also that's why we have the backup. So we always have that, which is kind of the reason. But you'll see in the history, it is clone stamping. So it is a permanent step that if you go back on, it undoes it, but you can't just hit erase with the eraser and fix it. And the issue that I was saying I had sometimes is in After Effects and Fusion, you can have the issue where if you set your source where you painted, the program looks at what's underneath the paint. So you could be kind of copying something that you don't think is there, but it actually is. So that's a separate issue. But if you ever had that issue, that's why. So again, I'll keep going through painting out my light, and then I kind of start to realize that, oh crap, there's a lot of lines. And there's a lot of lines behind her, there's a lot of lines behind the light that you're going to have to replicate as well. So because of that, I would highly recommend kind of getting a clean area overall. So get the mass area and then remaking the lines one by one. So that's why this kind of a task is a lot more tedious, because the more intricate and complicated the plate you have to make or the background, the more work it's going to mean for you in the future. So again, I would probably just go through, finish getting rid of my stuff, and then just to show you the light or the line example, I'll get rid of this big area, and then I'll zoom in so you can really see it. I'll set my source right here, and then make my brush a little smaller. And then you'll notice I pretty much just have to kind of line up where it should be. There's a lot of art involved. There's a lot of going back and forth and seeing what's wrong, seeing what's right. But you'll go through and just set the point, line it up, go through, and you have to make it look believable. I would go through, I would take my time, I would probably have to redo things a couple times until I think it looks believable. And that's the key with this. It's making it look believable and realistic. So another issue that could arise, I'm just noticing now, is the texture of the grass isn't really coming through. So you see how smooth this is versus where you can really see the light hitting the turf. It's creating a lot more reflection where this isn't. So that'll be something I would have to try and work back in. I won't go into that here, but just another visual effects thing to think about. But I would go through the entire frame, get rid of the girl, get rid of the light, and then the biggest areas that I remember having issues with were, you'll notice this glow around her head. So that actually comes back in later, but this area in general, getting rid of the light, getting rid of all the blue, replicating the hedge. So really you're going through and changing everything in this area. And once you would do that, it would look something like this. Oh. Apparently. Kind of catch up in Photoshop. Yeah. So here's what a final version of it would look like as a clean plate. And you can see this is the after, this is the before. Really the only the major issues were we got rid of the ball, we got rid of everything. So I remember getting rid of this cord as well, so that's an issue. And then from there, once we would have this, which is the clean plate, you would go through and you can really see differences as far as what I changed to make it look believable. You can really tell I had to kind of reconstruct some of the tree edges to make it look believable. So even this, I had to take from other spots in here. So you're really looking at all parts of the image to try and see what's valuable to you as far as what you can use. I could have taken this pole, gotten rid of this tree completely, made another pole right there, and done it over here. It's just trying to kind of make a scene that looks realistic. So that's the clean plate. And once I have that, then I can go forward with using that in my visual effects to get rid of the light, because then I have this background right here that we could cut out where the girl and the light were, and then put it on top of that so it's covered. And then once it's covered, this is the confusing part. You have to cut out the girl because then she's covered, right? She's covered underneath this picture. Okay, is everyone following? I'm trying to explain it really slowly. So we would take a shape just like this. Let me actually do this while I'm explaining it. I would take a shape in this kind of area. So I would take that shape, put it over the girl and the light, right? Hide them both. And the only way to get the girl back is to cut her out frame by frame and put her back over top of that. So this example is a little more of a complicated one. Usually you wouldn't have to do that. You would just have to get rid of the light, and then the girl would be separate. But go ahead and go into the visual effects of it. But yeah. So any questions on that as far as, yeah?
How would you implement that in After Effects? Would you use tracking or something?
Yeah, so there's a lot in this one, but yes, tracking is one of the tools you would use. Yeah, it's a little more explanation, but this is the final product. So if you guys remember, this is the original with her running across the screen. But I think you're kind of asking that question because you're noticing the fact the camera.
Yeah, because it's different than the other
Exactly.
the last example where
Yeah.
it's a still shot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're bringing a good point. So for those of you who weren't here last week, we did an equipment removal or fix, in our case, is a practical example of just flipping a car around with a stationary shot. So we had, imagine just a shot of you guys, and then to change something in the shot, because it was stationary, we could retake the shot and then just cut out what we wanted, but because we couldn't get the clean plate for this one, we had to do it this way. But this one was moving, whereas that one was just a stationary shot. So there's a lot more that goes into it when it's more of a three-dimensional or two-dimensional move by comparison. So the final version looks something like this, where you can see the lights pretty much removed. And I'll kind of go slowly for you here. You'll see what? Yeah, this is the version I had without getting rid of it. You'll see this was just all reconstructed, and then the way I got her back in, if you notice ever so slightly, I'm sure you can notice one of my errors, the shapes around her head, body parts, legs, feet, everything, we cut back out frame by frame in a technique called rotoscoping, if you're not familiar with it. But yeah, so you'll notice, even you can still see in this version the blue from the frame, or from the light head. So you can see that I didn't really get rid of in this version of it. But you get the basic idea. So, any other questions? That's basic gist as far as how you would make a clean plate, just like how Gabby and I showed you. And then as far as bringing it into After Effects and doing all that other stuff, we weren't going to cover that just because this is more of a Photoshop one, but that is an example of an effect you can pull off.